Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Two Trees podcast. My name is John Dillon, and I am here with a special guest from the AWKNG School of Theology. Our good friend Mike Chu is here to talk to us about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Good morning. Well, it's morning for us, but good morning, Mike. How are you?
Good morning, John. Good morning, guys. Good to be back on the show. Thanks for inviting me again.
Oh, anytime we can have you here is exciting for us. I think you're a great man of God, and I love how your brain approaches these problems, and you're able to unpack the scripture in a way that's really been a blessing to me. But one of the topics that has come up a lot in our study of scripture has been this thing called the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And I had never heard of it until I read The Unseen Realm, and it messed up all my preconceived ideas about what I was reading. I read the book, and I was convinced he was wrong. Dr. Heiser was wrong because it disagreed with my college notes. And then I went back through it a second time, and it turned out I was wrong, and that's always a hard pill to swallow. And so this phrase comes up a lot for people who are studying the Old Testament. And for people maybe who aren't familiar with it or are just beginning to really think about it, can you tell us in just a short, maybe summary kind of a thought, what the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is, and then if you can just unpack where we get that from in Scripture and your thoughts on the topic.
So the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, it's just a shorthand way to describe this Old Testament and really ancient Judaism kind of concept that all of the nations in the world have been assigned a particular overseeing guardian to watch over them. But that in particular, the nation of Israel has been designated to be solely God's chosen nation, or in other words, Yahweh's special project that he was working on. And so the Deuteronomy 32 worldview was a particular way of describing how did the Israelites and later on Second Temple Jews understood the nations, of how did the nations come to have all these various different religions, different gods that they worshiped. And so they saw it from this perspective that it was Yahweh who actually assigned each of these people groups a particular god or guardians to actually watch over that particular people group. Mm-hmm. But for Israel themselves, they were God's chosen people to be his special project. To later on, as they would discover, they were meant to be a light to the nations, to bring them back to Yahweh. So that's a short summary of what that whole entire idea unpacks. And that's eventually something that is later played out throughout the Old Testament, and then later into the New Testament as we go into the letters of Paul, into the Gospels themselves, into the book of Acts. This idea that the nations are being called back from the gods that they were assigned and back to the worship of Yahweh. Hmm.
Now, is this a type of thinking that you grew up with, Mike, or is this something that you've learned along the way?
It's kind of interesting, right? Because I grew up in, I became a Christian when I was 15, and I grew up in a Chinese heritage church. And so the background of that, it was a little bit different, where, every so often we would have guest speakers come and tell us about the conversion of Chinese families in Hong Kong. And one of the things that they would do is that the family, after they committed their lives to Christ, the pastors often would encourage them, especially if they did like ancestral worship of, past relatives, ancestors in their families, to go and to actually remove the miniature altars and little sacrifice areas of incense and whatever else, to remove it from the home. Mm-hmm. To say, hey, you've committed your life to Christ. Now, you have to get rid of the idols. You have to get rid of all these other things that are seen as worship to other gods. And in particular, one speaker who came from a church in Hong Kong, he told us of a time when he and his church had done that. And the family was happy that they removed the altars, they removed the idols. And that night, after the pastors left, the husband and wife had the worst argument they ever had in their lives, to the point that they were even threatening divorce with each other, which had never happened before. And that pastor in particular, he saw that as evidence of a spiritual attack, that there was resistance to the fact that now this family that used to belong to this kind of, worship practice was now forsaking it and going to the worship of Christ alone. And that it itself was evidence of a battle of like, why did all this stuff come up? Why did this dredge up? Why did this happen after they had prayed and removed the little altars and little like incense locations? Why did it occur on that night? And so I guess in some sense, I've always had a little bit of a sense of like the supernatural, but I never actually knew in particular this hard kind of concept that from the Jewish perspective, every nation was assigned a guardian. Every nation group was given some supernatural being or spiritual being that was meant to oversee and to watch over the people. And so it's a mix. I think when I encountered Dr. Heiser's concept and his description for the first time, it was weird, but it also didn't necessarily grind against the worldview that I had just because of the background that I came from.
Well, I mean, and that makes sense too. And I've heard quite a few stories like that. And my experience as a pastor has taught me the same thing, that the supernatural world isn't imaginary. It's just as real as anything else. And you begin to notice patterns and things, that are going on behind the scenes of people's lives. And there's either a whole lot of unique coincidences all happening at the same time in the same way, or this is what is happening, and the Bible is describing this correctly. But it's kind of one of those things that doesn't fall immediately into most people's thinking, because we're used to thinking of, there's God and that's it. Maybe angels, but those are kind of like autonomous robots that God ships down here. Thinking of them as people, or of there being real powers and principalities in the darkness, is uncomfortable for a lot of people. And so when they read their Old Testament, and their New Testament, especially Acts, we're tempted to just kind of strip all this supernatural language out of there and just substitute that as, well, that was superstition. And the Bible doesn't seem to be talking that way at all. It even talks, I think it's Daniel, where he prays and the angel is dispatched to talk to him, and he talks about Michael, your prince, has been like, your prince. Where did that idea come from? And then we just kind of push past it, and we don't talk about this anymore. That the world is a little more complicated than the Sunday school stories might have led us to believe. The idea that the Bible isn't a children's story, but that it's the real world, and it's just as complicated as real life is. And so I'm excited to hear you walk us through this, because I get a lot of texts or emails about this. And where would you recommend people start their approach to this way of thinking? Walk us through this, not just in how do I explain this to people, but also in how can I study this for myself?
Well, I think one of the best ways to kind of start approaching this is, and this is actually something that I had been bringing up in a small group of ours at our church, where the reminding that the first 5 books of the scripture of the Old Testament and basically of our Bibles is essentially the core reading material that everyone else later on would always turn back to, would always think about, would always contemplate, percolate, chew on, allude to. And that when you even go into those 5 books are pretty much constantly always looking back to the book of Genesis. And then even inside the book of Genesis, it's alluding to and looking back at the first 11 chapters.
Right.
And I would even dare say, as Dr. Drew Johnson once pointed in one of his works, that even those 11 chapters are also looking at Genesis 1 to 3 in particular. And so if folks are just curious, if anything, about the illusion that there is some sense of a rulership or a guardianship, and that the Israelites, and especially the 5 books of the Torah, are grinding against, are pushing against the concept that we are subjugated to gods, or that we need to give any heed to anyone else besides Yahweh alone. That can even just be looked at Genesis 1, where it's talking about the creation of the heavens. And let me go into that in particular. So we have here in Genesis chapter 1, trying to find the part on the day where, there we go. Genesis chapter 1, verse 16. This is the part where God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. But the language even of itself is very indicative of the fact that they are not meant to be worshipped, but they were assigned the stewardship by someone of greater authority. Here in Genesis 1:16, it says, "And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the smaller light to rule the night, and the stars. And God placed them in the vaulted dome of heaven to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a 4th day." What's very interesting, and this was even something that my Old Testament Hebrew professor pointed out when we were going through the books of the Bible, was that in Genesis 1, a lot of times when you look at other creation stories from other regions and other religions, often especially if there is a pantheon of gods, you'll get the sense that the gods themselves had some sort of participation. They made something on their own, and that's why they have ownership of this. But here in Genesis 1, it's very clear from the narrator's perspective that anything and everything that we see in creation was created by God alone. The sun, the moon, the stars, the very things that a lot of the other peoples of other nations would tend to be drawn to worship, especially, for example, with the Egyptians. They would worship the sun. They even thought one of their gods was the sun itself. That, no, the sun, the moon, the stars, they were placed there by God. They are servants of God. They are meant to rule the day, rule the night. They are meant for the time and seasons, but they're not meant for worship. And so even from Genesis 1, we get this hint that there is something going on, that the typical things that folks would worship are not meant to be worshipped. And as we lead up into Deuteronomy 32, one of the things I think folks have, kind of push against when they hit Deuteronomy 32, and I often think this is just coming from the sad reality that a lot of our evangelicalism, we've inherited this kind of practice of proof texting biblical texts. We look at verses 8 and 9, and we don't even bother to try to understand what is the whole entire context of this chapter, where it's coming from. Most folks, if I ever talk about this, they don't even realize Deuteronomy 32 is called the Song of Moses. It's a song. It's a poem. It's not prose. It's not narrative. It's actually meant to be something to be sung, or to at least be thought of from a more artistic and more emotionally evocative way. Versus the rest of Deuteronomy is a lot of narrative, is a lot of prose, is a lot of description. But once you get to Deuteronomy 32, you're hitting music, you're hitting a song, you're hitting a poem. And so the way that you even think about it has to be different. But before we even get there, Deuteronomy 32 is a summation of everything that's talked about in the book of Deuteronomy. And those verses 8 to 9 are, in particular, they are referencing chapter 4. And this has been brought up before by Dr. Heiser and other scholars in the past, that Deuteronomy 32 is essentially a poetic version especially verses 8 to 9, they are a poetic version of what's happening in Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 to 20. And so let me read that for the audience here. And do this so that you do not lift your eyes toward heaven and observe the sun and the moon and the stars, all the hosts of the heaven, and be led astray and bow down to them and serve them. Things that Yahweh your God has allotted to all of the peoples under all of the heaven. But Yahweh has taken you, and he's talking about Israel, and brought you out from the furnace of iron from Egypt to be a people of inheritance to him as it is this day. So already in chapter 4, the people are already exhorted by Moses. Don't worship the sun, moon, and stars. Don't do the things that you're seeing the other nations doing. You, Israel, you were allotted by God to be his inheritance. You're his people. And so don't worship those other objects that everyone else is.
That makes total sense. When you look at the creation story and really take a look at how often the Bible talks about angels and things as stars, and the language that it uses for the gods of the nations, it's this concept that they desire to worship something other than God. And God isn't endorsing that as much as he is saying what your heart is seeking, you're going to find. And he sets Israel up as a way to bring the nations back into fellowship with him. Am I on the right track with that?
I would say you're on the right track. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of times we often forget, was that Israel, they were chosen, like pretty much Abraham shows up on the scene after Genesis chapter 11. And this is again, we're looking back. To understand Deuteronomy 32, you have to be able to remember what happened before. And what we have in Genesis 10 to 11 is in the aftermath of the flood, of this great reset of the creation of humanity. Heck, even in chapter 9, Noah is given this exhortation, this command to be fruitful, just like Adam and his wife were. That essentially Noah is a new Adam. Like, we've reset. Everything has been wiped clean, literally has been wiped clean. And so let's start again. Noah, I'm giving you the same command to be fruitful, to multiply, to spread throughout the earth. And then what we get in Genesis 10 and 11 is essentially rebellion, where the people don't want to leave. They want to instead make a name for themselves. And that's what we often call the Tower of Babel. And the saddest thing for me whenever I reflect upon the story of Babel is that the irony of creating a tower to make a name for themselves, right? Scholars believe that it's essentially a ziggurat structure. It's a stair-like pyramid structure. And at the very top, you're supposed to essentially have the meeting place between heaven and earth, where the humans, the priests on the top of the ziggurat would invoke and call down the gods to meet them. And in Genesis 11, you have God. He does come down, but he doesn't come down to the top of the ziggurat. He comes down right to the ground level where everyone is at. And it's such an irony to me that the people who are saying, we want to call down God and we want to make a name for ourselves, we want to meet him where, like up in the heavens where he is. And yet he has no qualms about coming down right to the dirt, right to the ground level with us.
Yeah.
And to look up at the tower and then say to himself and probably to all the other, loyal divine beings, this is not good. This is absolutely not good. And we're going to have to confuse their language. We're going to have to force them to scatter. We're going to have to set them into a position where they have no choice but to go. And that's when we get into Genesis 12. where God decides to focus his time and energy on one family, on one man, to start with one nation through Abraham.
Yeah, and he makes a new nation. It's not like he just picked one of the ones that were floating around and said, okay, I'm going to choose this one. He's making something almost out of nothing again. It's that idea of...
Pretty much.
Yeah, I think it's really, it just shows the heart of God, you know. Mankind wants God on our own terms, and they're trying to manipulate, and in a way trying to say, you know, we decide what's right and wrong. We decide how this happens. And what God does is always surprising to me. He doesn't ever, if I wrote this book, it would not go at all this way. It's far more creative and more beautiful and more in-depth than anything that I would have come up with. And maybe I'm just not very creative. But every time I read through Genesis, I'm always like, wow, that is an unexpected and beautiful move, Lord. I really love what you're doing here. And it's blessed my life tremendously. You know, I always thought of the Tower of Babel as just like this throwaway part of Genesis. And that's where languages come from. And so finding out that it has tremendous weight throughout the rest of Scripture was really surprising for me. And thinking of the nations as, you know, they desire the darkness, and that's what they got. They desired the gods or the to worship these false gods, and that's what they wound up with. And then when you find Jesus, he's kind of the opposite of that. He's going everywhere he's not supposed to go, doing things he's not supposed to do, and bringing little pockets of Eden, and ultimately on the cross, the salvation of the world. And it just is so fascinating to me that this isn't God losing control. This is God showing his power as the creator of the universe, the king of all. And I'm going to get off on my soapbox here, but I just wanted to give God a shout out. I love it.
No. I mean, preach, amen. It's one of those things that I do love about Genesis in particular, is that you have, like you said, John, the beauty of God. On one hand, you see the wonder of just an amazing, graceful, merciful God that he is. I mean, I'm still blown away by the idea that he comes down to the ground and that he looks up at the tower. Of this little thing in comparison to where he just came from. And he's looking up and it's like, this ain't good. But that he actually came down to ground level with the common man. He came down to the literal ground.
As like a foreshadowing of the coming of Christ?
I mean, I think there are things, there are illusions, there are like hints of the kind of God that we follow. And that this is a pattern, and this is just a part of his habit, a part of who he actually is, that often surprises us. And so that it's beautiful, but it also saddens me in the fact that he comes down to the ground level and they're like, oh, we need to build this fancy thing in order to call God because he needs this. He wants this. He wants us to be able to meet him up in the air. We have to work really hard. And he just comes down on his own. It's almost like, it's like you guys really didn't need to do any of that. You could have just called on me. You could have just asked for me to come. You didn't have to do all this. What are you trying to do? And the real motivation ultimately, right, in Genesis 11, that the narrator makes clear is they wanted to make a name for themselves.
Which
they didn't want to be scattered.
Yeah, it strikes me as almost the opposite of Micah 6:8, where it says, what does the Lord require of you but to do justly and love mercy and walk humbly? And I don't get that vibe at all from what's happening at Babel. It's very proud. You get this idea almost of forced labor, of the making of bricks and all those things. And what God has said from the beginning is that he desires a relationship with his people. He loves us enough to come down. It's our sin. It's our own selfishness. It's our own foolishness that has separated us from Eden. And even, you know, Noah, as like Adam 2.0, he makes a garden up on top of that mountain, and then it falls into sin up there. So it's not like this hasn't been done before. It's been done over and over and over again, and it's God's faithfulness and his love and compassion that reaches us even in the moments when we have no right to expect that he's going to. And the calling of Abraham is one of, I think, the biggest ones. You know, you almost get this idea that God's just done with the nations. That's it. Like, That's not your first try. That's not your second try. That's not your third try. That's like over and over and over again. And at the moment you think like this is done, God says, but here's a new theme. Here is the salvation. Here is my hand reaching out to the people. And then that story catching on as the second half of Genesis makes it, I think, just a really wonderful book because it's not separated from it. It's like this unexpected line of music that's happening here. And I think it's really great. Keep going.
Well, and just even about Abraham himself, right? He wasn't just created out of the dirt and just made as like a new human being. Let's try again. He was drawn out from the nations themselves, from the nations that were scattered.
Right.
And not only that, the whole entire story, as you trace through the narrative of Abraham, he messes up again and again. He sins again and again. He lies about Sarah, his wife, twice. He gives in to fear of his own life, of self-preservation. And yet he has these moments of epiphany where he realizes, this God is really actually someone I really want to follow. Like, this is actually worth it. Like, I'm going to give a tithe. I'm going to give this priest. You actually know who this God is, to Melchizedek. Like, I'll give you a tenth of what I have. That all of a sudden he is slowly on a journey to realizing and learning and knowing who this God truly is. To the point that when we have that moment before Sodom and Gomorrah, and of what I personally suspect is a theophany of the three beings that appeared to Abraham and Sarah and saying, hey, you're going to have a son. And then two of these beings walk off towards Sodom and Gomorrah. The third one sticks around talking with Abraham. And all of a sudden, this third being starts talking as though he himself is Yahweh. Mm. Of like, am I going to keep anything hidden from Abraham? And has a conversation side by side like friends. That to me is a beautiful kind of picture in a moment of like, this is a little bit of the hint of the heart of God, of what he's always longed for. Of yes, we need to return back to Eden, to the time when humanity and God walked in the garden, when we actually could fellowship and commune with each other without any walls, without any obstacle. And so what we have here is this picture of what God had wanted through Abraham. And we see that later in the book of Exodus, when after all that he did in Egypt, and before he even gives the 10 Commandments and the covenant, he tells the people of Israel, you are my treasured possession. You are my segula. That there is this beautiful thing that they didn't have to do anything to earn it. They didn't have to do anything to gain it. It was because of the mere love and the faithfulness of God towards his promise for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that this nation of 12 clans would become his treasured possession, would be his vassal state, would be his representative to the rest of the nations of the world.
And I think that's a cool thing about Abraham too, is I know like Hebrews says he's looking for a city not made with hands, but he's constantly moving into these areas where he's running into all these pagan peoples. If he was like, God doesn't move him to like this really great spot of ground and say, just stay here. Like he's moving. He's a constant either blessing or curse to wherever he's going. And so you can see right from the beginning, God has come down to the ground like he did at Babel, and he's showing himself over and over again. And I love especially the story of, I think it's Abimelech, where there's the dispute over a well, and Abraham is just a blessing. He's a peacemaker. And you see this instance of an exile here on earth, but wandering as though he was already enjoying the fruits of heaven. There's just so much packed into these stories that makes me wonder then at the rebellion and the heart of mankind, because it doesn't matter what culture you look at, we seem to be eager to push off of following God and to desire to define right and wrong for ourselves. I think of like Exodus 12:12, where it talks about, I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, and on all of the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. And these Egyptians have seen the hand of God revealed. Why did they not just pursue the God of Abraham? It strikes me as so strange that they would then rush back to the worship of these false gods like that. Does that connect to Deuteronomy 32, do you think?
So one of the interesting things in the book of Exodus is that there is this line that indicates that there was not just the Exodus or the great multitude of Israelites that left, but that there was also a multitude of Gentile nations that left. Otherwise, in other words, these folks who were not Israelite, they were not Semitic, and yet they realize after watching 10 plagues, whatever is going on with these people, we want to go with them. We don't want to stay here in Egypt. And if they get to go, we're going to go too. And so essentially you have an exodus of two kinds of people. Yes, of the Jew, of the Israelite, but also of the Gentile, where they had seen the power of Yahweh and realized, we want to stick with you guys because your God seems to be the real deal. And, there is no strong indication about, what happened to those people. And yet I do remember reading before some material about how there was speculation that Caleb and his father, that they themselves were not actually Israelite.
Yeah, I've heard that
too. That they had joined up along with the group of Israelites as they left Egypt. Now, whether it means that they were actually part of that other multitude that left Egypt, or they were just nomads that happened to come upon them in the wilderness and realize, wow, you guys have a God that seems really cool, a lot better than the one that we worship. And so either case, that seems to be part of the intention is that, yes, as a people chosen by God, that the way that they live, the way they conduct themselves, and the very awesomeness and the wonder of this God that they follow, it's supposed to be so attractive. And so it percolates this curiosity within them that they will want to check out who this God is. And so it's an interesting pattern.
Yeah, it makes me think of the book of Jonah, too. I mean, that's a Gentile nation in Nineveh, but the theme of the book is that God is still God. There may be people worshiping these other beings, and they may have authority in those places, but in no way does God ever surrender his kingship of all that is. That there's a responsibility to our Maker, no matter what our preconceived ideas are or where our loyalties lie. We were made to image God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But let's take it back to Deuteronomy 32, because I know that some folks will, they'll have a little bit of pushback because of the particular translations that they're looking at, that they'll assume, wait, how did you get this idea? How did Dr. Heiser get this idea? Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I were to look at Deuteronomy 32 in the NIV version, it would say, when the Most High, being God, gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all humanity, he set up boundaries for the peoples, according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted inheritance. And what most often will happen is that folks will say, I don't see anything about the gods. I don't see anything about guardian beings or spiritual beings being assigned to the nations. It says here, sons of Israel, that the nations were broken up by the sons of Israel. And what they don't realize is that there is actually a translation issue, a manuscript issue that's happening in those particular verses. And if we were to go to a translation such as the ESV, in that translation, it says this, similarly, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, so on and so forth. But it gets down to, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God.
Mm. Well, that's
the
a big
Lord's
difference.
portion is his people. It's a big difference. And oftentimes a lot of folks will say, Deuteronomy 32 worldview, Dr. Heiser, all these other scholars, you're just basing it off of one translation verse, one manuscript. And what they don't realize is that this is a result of a debate that has been going on for centuries, if not for millennia, about what are these verses actually supposed to say. For the longest time, when we have been translating the scriptures, especially into English, most of the time from Hebrew to English, the translation committee will be using a compiled text called the Masoretic text. That essentially is what you would find in any Jewish Bible, any Hebrew Bible that goes back to essentially the earliest full copy that we have goes back to around the 1000s.
So medieval.
And this is from the medieval ages. And essentially what we have with the Masoretic text is a text that says Bene Yisrael, so the number of the sons of Israel. And for the longest time, that these scholars would look at that and say, all right, this is what the Hebrew Bible has. This is what the Jewish people have in their Bibles. And yet when we look at a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from the Septuagint,
which is a lot older than 1000 AD.
Which is a lot older, but there was always debate about why is there a variance. And so in the Septuagint translation, for example, the one that I have here, it says, when the Most High distributed nations and he scattered the descendants of Adam, he set up boundaries for the nations according to the number of the angels of God. And his people Jacob became the portion of the Lord, Israel an allotment of his inheritance. For the longest time, all the way until about the mid-20th century, there were debates of whether the Septuagint was representing a scribal tradition that was separate from the Masoretic text, or was it just a variation of the Masoretic text? Was it just maybe these translators of the Septuagint, they were just taking some license. Maybe they were incorporating some Greek pagan kind of ideas into their translation. And it wasn't until we hit 1947 that we encountered and discovered these scrolls that is now commonly known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. In scholarly talk, they're often called the Qumran writings. And it's mainly because there's a suspicion that these scrolls were stored away in these jars by a community that lived in a region called Qumran. And what they had discovered in this kind of like inventory of, scriptural, of these scrolls from Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and other languages, they found remnants of Deuteronomy, especially Deuteronomy 32. And what they found within those manuscripts was the testimony that Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9, use the word Bene Elohim, sons of God, indicating finally, after many decades of kind of debate and scholarly research, that the scholarly consensus is coming around to the realization that Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9 is not supposed to say sons of Israel, but actually probably said sons of God. And the reasons for that are multifaceted. There's a lot of suspicion that the Masoretic scribes, that tradition family that passed down the scriptures as they copied and made more copies and eventually kept going down, that there was a little bit of a desire to guard the monotheistic worship of Yahweh. And that when they got to verses 8 to 9, it made them a little bit uncomfortable. And so they decided to switch some of the letters around. At least that's one theory, that the letters were changed around just enough to make it look like the sons of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, instead of Bnei Elohim. But when we look at the Dead Sea Scroll witness, and when we look at other witnesses like the Samaritan Pentateuch, that is also pretty old, and then the Septuagint, that also we know is probably drawing from a tradition that's gone well before 1000 AD, that the line of thinking is that this probably was originally the sons of God.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It's a very fascinating thing to kind of realize that the Septuagint, which was often kind of relegated as like a second fiddle, of like, well, you know, that's a nice translation and everything, but it's not as good as the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text that we have here. That because of the Dead Sea Scrolls being another witness to it, especially a witness that's centuries earlier than even the Septuagint, that this is likely more original than what we have from the manuscripts that at least date back to 1000 AD. And so, you know, we have to start wrestling with the reality that the scripture writers were actually talking about some concept that is very different and very foreign to us. That there are these divine beings or spiritual beings that were allotted or assigned some sort of guardianship or oversight of people groups. And that God, in the meanwhile, was focusing his time and attention on one particular people group, the people of Jacob, the people of Israel.
Well, and that makes sense too when you read like Daniel, and it talks about the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece, Michael, the prince of Israel. Like, did Daniel seems to have known what that meant without really being confused by that. And you either have to assume that Daniel just made that up whole cloth, and that's the first time anyone's ever talked about this, or you recognize that there's a pattern in Scripture where this has been going on. Deuteronomy 32 is probably the best place where it just comes right out and says it. But this isn't by any stretch of the imagination the only place that this crops up in the Old Testament.
No, I mean, like I had mentioned before, Deuteronomy chapter 4 alluded to the idea that, again, the sun, moon, and stars, you know, they were allotted to the other peoples, but you, Israel, you're not supposed to be worshiping them.
Right.
And like there is this idea that gets repeated again and again. And honestly, this is actually something that I generally recommend this resource for anyone that wants to explore Deuteronomy 32, like really deep dive into some scholarly material. I always recommend this book called The Gods of the Nations by Dr. Daniel Block.
It's a super good
He wrote
book.
this back. It is a terrific book, and he wrote it in the mid-90s as part of his kind of dissertation work, and he explored in this book how did the people of essentially, you know, of the Middle East, of the Palestinian area, how did they conceive of the idea of the relationship between them and their gods? And in his book, he has this wonderful way of kind of breaking it down, of this triangle where you have a deity, a people, and a land. And the two primary models that we see in the ancient Near East, as testified by the Hebrew scriptures and then by other materials from the ancient Near East, from other, you know, Canaanite and Ugaritic nations, for example, they're testifying to the idea that either the deity has a relationship with the land that's primary, or that the deity has a relationship with the people that is primary. And whichever way that plays, then there's something that significantly plays out differently. A lot of the times, the most common model that you find in the Palestinian and Syrian area was the deity's relationship to the land is primary. That the god or the gods have a really deep intrinsic connection to a territory, to a land, to a place. And if your people just happen to be living on that land, well, you're now subjugated to that deity. You're now beholden to that God.
Yeah, he has clout
And
there.
so
That's his space.
essentially,
He's got the ability to manipulate people to, well, I mean, he's like a territorial spirit.
Exactly. And it's more than just a territorial. I mean, it's essentially almost expanding on the idea of like the city state of like we have control and reign over this area just because our God has control and reign over this area. And this is a little bit, when you start realizing that's the kind of concept that a lot of the peoples that the Israelites encountered, that they have in their mind, that the primary relationship is that the God and the land, that's first. We, the people, we're second. We're kind of like just nestled along with the land. That's why there's this surprise that the God of Israel can actually exert power in the land of Egypt.
Yeah, that's one of my
can
favorite parts
do things.
of it is like he doesn't go where he's supposed to go. He invades space.
Yeah.
I love like Jesus at Caesarea Philippi. Just this idea that he's not at all restrained by the conventions of people's opinions. The demons, the powers of darkness, they flee. I love when Jesus crosses over the lake into Bashan, and the demonic possessed man says, the demons are shouting, have you come to harass us before our time? And the idea is they're like almost like a legion, it says, which is like a military force. And the first thing they do is just surrender. Like, we give up. We had no idea you were coming over here. It's not fair that you're here. But it connects also to this idea that Satan brings up in the temptation of Jesus when he looks to Jesus and he says, if you'll bow down and worship me, I'll give you all the nations that are here. Or the place in Paul's writings where he talks about Satan as the god of this world. And what really messed me up is I read all those things and I knew them to be true, but I didn't really connect them as important. I just kind of filed them away as, this is just Bible talk. And really what I began to see was, no, this is giving me a glimpse behind the curtain into how angelic or supernatural culture and power operates in our physical world. Because we know there are demonic forces, there are fallen spiritual beings who are exercising their evil on the earth. And then as soon as you talk about it with people, they seem to just back off like, well, I believe that, but I don't believe that. Well, I think that, but let's not get crazy here. Let's not actually think this is happening. And it just is always surprising to me because I found it myself too. But I get tremendous pushback sometimes about this idea.
And I think that it's an irony. One of my seminary professors said that the great irony about all this, about our kind of non-supernaturalistic worldview at times in the Western hemisphere, is that ironically, Christianity for a good long while won. Like the dominion of the gods were actually pushed back, and they lost territory, they lost ground, they lost people groups, they lost them all to the worship of Yahweh, to the worship of Jesus Christ. And it's so ironic that in some sense, because of the battles and victories that were won, we slowly forgot that there was actually real spiritual battle that was actually happening in the past, that there was actually territory that was being lost. There were rivals to the fame and the name of Yahweh. And so it's an interesting realization that the problem, in some sense, of this non-supernaturalistic worldview that we have is a result of the fact that we sort of did our job a bit in the Western Hemisphere, but we kind of neglected on actually reminding ourselves and remembering that there is actually another realm. There is an unseen realm that is out there. Now, Dr. Block in his book, he goes on, goes into the details about, like, yes, the deity and the land, that's the primary relationship. The people in the land, they're enslaved to this deity, they're beholden to this deity. And then he points out that there is another model, and it's the deity and that deity's relationship to the people as primary, and the land is secondary. And the only example of that in the Syrian-Palestinian area is ever testified about is in the Hebrew scriptures. And that to me is so significant. It was one of the things that he mentions in that book was how if you were a Canaanite that was living during the time when Israel was around in its full glory, monarchy and whatever else, and you're doing trade, you're a merchant, you're walking in and you're living amongst the Israelites, you would notice things that are similar, certain kind of assumptions about life and values and foods and whatever else that are familiar. But at the same time, there are very strange things that would be so weird and intriguing to you. And one of these, he believes, is that the people of Israel had a direct relationship with their God. And that their God was less concerned about the land than he was with the people.
Right. Even when they're in exile. When Babylon, you've got this, Israel is broken and they're scattered and they're living in Babylon. You don't get the idea that God is just waiting for them to come home. Ezekiel has this vision of God on his chariot. I just am amazed, really to think of God as the Lord of hosts, that he is a power, period. Doesn't matter where, doesn't matter what the conventions of people are or what deity claims to have power over a particular space or what supernatural power, that there is no God like our God. There is no spirit that is remotely close to the power of the Lord, that he's the maker of everything that is, and that these so-called gods, I kind of use the lowercase g kind of a thing, but it just amazes me. And I look to the Lord and I just say, man, you are wonderfully, beautifully powerful. And he's pursued us right down to the ground. That's cool.
I mean, mentioning even from Ezekiel, one of the visions that he had was of the spirit, the Shekinah glory of God leaving the temple. Mm-hmm. And then it goes off into a distance. But the direction that it heads off to is towards Babylon.
Yeah, that seems wrong.
And it seems wrong, but it's like in the midst of it all, right? Ezekiel, he was part of the second group of exiles from the land of Israel. The message is implying that, God's leaving the temple, like the protection over Israel, over Judah, it's gone. And you would think God basically is like, hey, I handed you over to the Babylonians. I handed your neighbors, the, northern Israel over to the Assyrians in the past. I'm leaving you guys behind. Good luck. He could have just done that. But instead, he heads towards Babylon, to the very place that he was telling the people, I'm sending you off in exile there. And the messaging is so clear to me. It was, guess what? I'm exiling myself there too. I'm going with you.
I'm going with you.
That
I will never
despite
leave you
all
or
the
forsake
brokenness.
you.
Yeah, despite the brokenness, despite their sin, despite their rebellion, despite their idolatry, their unfaithfulness to God, the breaking of the covenant, everything that they had done, the fact that he made them his allotted inheritance and they spat in his face by worshiping other gods and other deities. And yet, in the midst of the very chastisement, the punishment that he is enforcing, he's going with them. And, even this past Sunday in my church, my pastor talked about Jeremiah 29, and not from the typical verse that everyone always likes to quote from, but from the fact that Jeremiah 29 is talking to a people that they are going to be sent off to exile. They're not going to be, back in Israel for a good 70-something years. At least 2 generations of people will live and die in Babylon. They'll never see Jerusalem again. They'll never see the land of Judah again. And yet his words in Jeremiah 29 is really about settle down in Babylon, have families, marry your kids off, grow crops, plant roots, pray for the city of Babylon, pray that they actually will prosper, pray for the peace of the city. That he's telling them, It's going to be 70 years. But be a blessing even while you're in Babylon. Be a blessing to the people there.
That to
even
me
in the
is
midst of
the most powerful thing in the book of Jeremiah as far as personal application. And that's one of my favorite texts, period, because I think it shows what the Christian exile is called to do. It doesn't matter where we are or how an election goes or anything like that. We are called to be a blessing, to be a tree by the waters. And it's just laid out so clearly. If you've never read that text in Jeremiah, you need to really focus on more than just the I know the plans that I have for you part. Keep reading. There's some fantastic stuff in that chapter.
Yeah, and I think that's it again, that comes back to how a lot of times in our evangelicalism, we proof text, right? We focus on just that verse and then we apply it to our immediate circumstance and not realize the greater wide context of what that passage is saying.
Right.
That God's message to the people, I know the plans I have for you. That part of that plan involves you being sent off to exile. Part of that plan involves you being amongst a people that don't speak your language, that don't eat your food, and that will look at you as second-class citizens because guess what? We conquered you. But guess what? Your orders from this point on is to be a blessing to that people too. To pray for them, to seek the peace of the city, to actually be a light to that nation while you're living there.
Which is the Abraham story, isn't it? Like he's called, he's wandering in all these places, and everywhere he goes, you got this little pocket of Eden that surrounds this guy. And no matter what he does, God is blessing the man. And I definitely don't think he's going to get Husband of the Year award ever because he's not a great person. Like as far as his morality goes, he messes up constantly. But the grace of God is not based on his performance as a representative, but on the nature of God. I'm going to have you come to my church and preach that, brother. That's fantastic. And I think you do a great job of this. Can I ask a couple clarifying questions that I sometimes get about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview?
Yes, please.
So when you say that the gods of the nations, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that these are gods like God is God, like he's one of many out there? Are you trying to tell me that Thor and the myths of the Norse are true and that the myths of the Egyptians are true? What do you mean when you say the gods of the nations?
When I say the gods of the nations, I'm using like if words could literally be popping out from my mouth in like a visual way, I would be using those lowercase g for gods. I don't mean the omnis, right? I don't mean omnipresent, omniscience. Like I don't mean that they have on equal level the power and the majesty and the glory of Yahweh alone. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think that's one of the misconceptions that oftentimes we have in English is because we've reduced it all down to one word, God. And in that one word, it has to do the heavy lifting of multiple concepts. Do you mean the God that is omnipresent, that is omniscient, that is omnipotent? Or do you mean a spiritual being that has some authority, has some power, but is limited, was created, has a beginning, him or herself or itself, however you want to describe it, that it actually is a creation, not the creator. And so when I say gods of the nations, I am talking about spiritual beings that at this point now in our time and context have masqueraded before people groups as though they are omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent. They're essentially the Wizard of Oz, and that they don't want you to check behind the curtain. That they don't want you to like, hey, I don't want you to really actually notice that I can't do any of this stuff that you say that I can, right? It was this amazing moment, right? Again, we're going back to Exodus when Moses and Aaron appear before Pharaoh for the first time, and they throw down their staffs, Moses' staff comes a serpent. And then what does Pharaoh's magicians do? They
Same
throw
thing.
down their staffs and they become snakes as well. It's like, hey, look, you can do that. We can do that too. But only Moses' staff that was transformed by Yahweh then eats the other serpents, and essentially the magician's staffs are gone. It's like oh, you can do some shape shifting here, can you? All right. Can yours eat mine? It's
Yeah.
just like this moment of like, well, we can't do that.
We,
And later on, even these magicians in the narrative to Pharaoh is like, we can't replicate this. We can't do this kind of magic. We don't have the power to do that. We have no idea how this is happening. That it's counterfeit. It's all of a sudden you only can go so far with your power because you are not the actual creator. And
I like it.
It just plays out that way.
I always thought it was kind of, I don't know, that God had kind of a sense of humor. You know, I assumed that those magicians, like, they probably brought their favorite staff. You know, maybe it was like a sign of office or whatever. They didn't get it back. Like, the staff got eaten. Like, those guys walking out of the room are like, man, that was my favorite one, and now it's gone. And I don't know. I just think it's funny. But it's one of those moments where God just flexed and said, you know, you thought you were my equal. Let me make it abundantly clear that you are not. And I just think it's really a cool story. And it happens other places too, like Elijah on Mount Carmel. There's just over and over again, God makes certain that people know that these are not like him. They're supernatural beings. And in the ancient world, they used the word God to describe supernatural beings.
And you know, even just if folks just wanted to go back to even just some like more again scholarly the kind of context and material, that book from Daniel Block, he mentions that a lot of the Canaanite nations in the ancient Near East, a lot of the things that they did, the rituals that they did, the religious practices they did, a lot of that was their best guess because they didn't know what their gods actually wanted. And so, like, oh, let's try this little thing. Let's just do this little ritual. Let's, like the prophets of Baal with Elijah, cut ourselves and try to get the attention of Baal. And the merciful wonder about who the God of Israel is that, hey, well, we're going to have a covenant. And not only are we going to have a covenant, I'm going to lay it very clear to you what this relationship is all about. That if you need me to respond, you do this. If you want to come to approach me, you got to make sure you do this purification thing. He lays out the rules and rituals and lays out exactly if they do this correctly, if they do this with observance, this is what will happen. If they pray to Jerusalem, like Solomon would later say as he inaugurated the temple, that if the Jewish people were to look and pray towards the temple, God would hear from heaven. And, you know, we've been talking about Daniel a lot. That's the suspicion of why Daniel, as part of the practice that he did for himself, that he would fast and pray and be praying towards Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think that's
was
really
that
cool.
He was remembering the words of Solomon.
When you think about the law,
hey,
go ahead. Yeah.
It was just like, hey, like, you know, God actually agreed with what Solomon said. Like, you know what? I like that idea. That if you're praying and you're looking towards the temple, where the temple is, and you're praying to me and you're calling out for my name, I will respond.
Yeah.
And Daniel is in the midst of doing that. That's why that you know angel comes and says, sorry, I was delayed. You know, we did, you know, God did hear your prayer. I was just delayed a bit, but he heard your prayer because why?
Yeah, because of this faithfulness.
But that Daniel was doing what Solomon had said, like, hey, God, will you do this? That if we are praying to you, facing the temple towards Jerusalem, will you respond to our prayer? And God is like, that's a great idea. I love that. I'll do that. And Daniel is following along with that idea.
Yeah, when I read the book.
That the relationship.
Yeah. I found it really interesting.
Our relationship with God is not ambiguous.
Right. And that's the thing. Like, when I read the law growing up, I always was like, man, this is a lot of rules. And it felt like a weight. And then when I read the book that you're talking about by Dr. Block, he was talking about this as a gift that God gave. This is clarification. way more clarification than maybe they thought they were ever going to get. And it was a weight off their minds to know, okay, now I know what you want. I'm not guessing anymore.
Exactly. And like, to me, like, I often look at the Exodus 19 and 20 moment as a DTR between God and Israel. We're going to define the relationship finally. It's been ambiguous. We've been dating a bit. I saved you from this terrible, terrible, guy, Egypt. I got you out from that bad situation because I love you. I've always loved you. I've had a promise that I've been keeping for all these centuries. Now here, before, as we stand between the sky and the earth, let's lay it out. Let's have a DTR. Let's define the relationship.
I like it.
Let's work it out. And so we understand, you do this, I will respond. I do this, you will respond. That there is an actual understanding of this relationship. But for the ancient Near East nations, oftentimes they were guessing.
Yeah. I got another question for you about
with
that.
The Baal prophets.
Yeah. So
yeah,
we talked earlier about these spirits being having power over specific places. So here in Ohio, we have what are called mounds, Indian mounds, and those are places of ancient worship and burial. And all over the world, you have temples that were dedicated to specific gods or different things. Do you think that those spirits still have power over those territories?
I think because of what Jesus had done on the cross, that everything has been void. The way that things were done has been void. Mm. I don't think it was a coincidence, right? That going back to Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9, it says, according to the number of the sons of God. And scholars believe that, yes, obviously there is a connection that's going on with Deuteronomy to Genesis 10 and 11. And if you were to count the number of nations that are listed, especially in Genesis 10, it comes out around 70. Sometimes the number will be 72, depending on what manuscript translation you're looking at. But then, coincidentally enough, we have Jesus in the Gospels when he's sending out his disciples to go and preach to these towns and cities around the area. He pairs them up 2 by 2, and their number comes up to, again, depending on which manuscript you're looking at, 70 or 72.
Perfect.
That there seems to be a connection that is happening here. And it seems clear to me that Jesus is not concerned about the borders and the territorial markers anymore after the cross. He sends and tells them in the Great Commission in Matthew to go out. Yes, start out locally, start in this concentric circle and slowly move out, but you eventually have to move out towards the nations. And I believe, and this is just like my own personal opinion right now, is that the territories that may have belonged to or were given to these other gods or these divine beings, they're defunct now. They no longer apply. It doesn't mean that they don't like it. Doesn't mean that they won't fight it. Doesn't mean that they won't resist. But the Lord, the earth is the Lord's and everything within it. And so as we are commissioned to go out as heralds, as missionaries, as evangelists, as folks telling the good news, the gospel message of the King Jesus that we are following, peoples are supposed to know this king is here and he is delivering us from the enslavement of these other gods, all of these gods that had tricked us into believing that they actually have power, that they are not truly the wizard that they try to convey themselves to us as.
I think there's a really cool and thought the Oracle at Delphi, who's one of the most famous temples in ancient Greece. But when Julian the Apostate tried to rebuild the temple there at Delphi, the temple of Apollo, he gets this last message from the Oracle, and it's the last one that was ever recorded. And it says, "Tell the emperor that the didactic hall has fallen. No longer does Phobos have his chamber, nor mantic laurel, nor prophetic spring, and the speaking water has been silenced." it sounds like if that really is a demon or a creature of the supernatural world talking back, he's saying everything that was good here got wrecked by something, by someone. Some enemy has come and sacked Apollo's kingdom.
Yeah.
And I can't help but think that that's Jesus, that moving through the supernatural world, that the powers, the principalities, they have lost their right. They have lost their hold. And in my mind, I just visualize the stone table and Aslan as he dies for Edmund and for the claim that is put on him by the witch. And there's this sense of through love and through death, the powers of darkness fail and fall. And I don't know how things officially work in the unseen realm, but I like picking your brain about it. And so I know there's no right answer to that because I don't know. I just wanted your opinion.
Yeah, I think that, ultimately all territories belong to our God, Yahweh, to our Lord Jesus Christ. And, I think one of the things that I've had to kind of like dial back and retreat from was the assumption that there was this monolithic kingdom or, like territory of darkness, that it was all ruled by just one leader and everyone else is some sort of little minion. And, they're all following the orders of just one head honcho, right. Satan or the devil or whatever else. And to realize that, maybe now these days, maybe that's what's happened right now. But at least during the Hebraic times, during the Hebrew Bible, it seems like you have a lot of different factions. They're all vying for control, for power, for dominance, and that in some sense, these territories that are set up, that they're even rivaling against one another of like, hey, don't you dare come into my land. This land is mine, and the people who are living here, they're mine. And it's almost like a violation if they were to cross certain borders or boundaries. And then you have Yahweh just rolling in. It's like, I'm sorry.
Well, and that's what he told us to do.
I'm sorry, but not really sorry.
Yeah, go and preach. So I got a call from a pastor friend of mine, and I'm supposed to go with him here in the near future. There's one of his parishioners is experiencing strange things in their house that they think is ghost-related or demonic-related. And so I'm going to go and do a blessing there. But this happens to me periodically. People ask me, and I go in. But one of the things that Hollywood tells you to do, I don't do. I don't sit there and try to figure out what's going on. Who are you? What's your name? Where'd you come from? Tell me your story. Like I'm in The Exorcist or something like that. I talk to Jesus, and I ask for his blessing, and I ask that his peace would come here, and if there is something here, that he would remove it. And when you really start putting this into practical terms, it really comes back to look to Jesus and put your faith and your trust in Jesus, because I don't see into the supernatural world. I don't know what's really happening here. And I don't, even if something were to tell me, like some voice in the darkness, I don't know that I trust what it says. And so I have to then find something that is unmovable, that is unshakable, and that's Jesus. And to look to this not as me trying to find the magic formula that drives out some spirit or some ghost, but instead look to Jesus and say, Lord, you have the power. Yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. And then leave it with him and pray with him. And I really would encourage anybody out there who's struggling with fears of territorial spirits or trying to make sense of this in your head to know that nothing we're talking about is detracting from the glory of God. None of us are saying that God isn't God, or that there are rivals to him, or that he could somehow lose, or that we're polytheists in some way. What we're saying is that God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, mighty and awesome. I always push the wrong button.
Yep.
Sorry about that, Mike. I'm way over my 1 hour minute. Do you mind if we record while we just chat here for a minute, and I can put this on the end of the episode as bonus material?
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
I didn't mean to cut you off, man. I should have given you a heads up. My bad.
No worries. I was wondering if we were coming up against that time. Because the last thing I was going to mention is like, in the end, every conversation about Deuteronomy 32, 8 to 9, like it has to go into Psalm 82, right?
Yeah.
Because that essentially is like where you get that full exposition that, like, how do we know that these gods are not meant to continue ruling? It's like, well, you got Psalm 82, and God is basically telling them, you're going to die like men.
Mm.
And to me, it's like, wow, like to if you're not de-supernaturalizing it, you're not trying to say that it's somehow like human beings or kings or priestly kings or human beings somehow, but to actually point out this is actually about spiritual beings being told that they have a limited lifespan, that they will die just like
Mm.
human beings.
Mm.
um, that's amazing, that's terrifying, that also sounds very just
I think so.
of beings that we can't see, we can't control, we can't really fight against physically at all, and yet their demise ultimately will be similar to mortals.
So I have a bunch of questions about that. Would you mind coming back on and walking us through Psalm 82?
I would love it. I would love to. Yeah. I hope it wasn't too distracting with the phone cutting out and
Oh,
my
no,
internet and
it's
stuff. But
totally fine. We'll figure it out. But I love that you're making time and coming on to talk with us. I got a ton of questions about Psalm 82, specifically about what does it mean when it says they will die like men. And I don't want you to spoil it here. I'm going to drop this at the end of the episode. But Mike, I'm looking forward. I'll send you a message. And if you don't mind, just give me a date that you want to come back on, and we'll make it happen.
all right, sounds good. Thanks, John.
All right, brother. It's good talking with you. I'll see you later.
Yep. Bye.